Jorge, ¿vas a poner la cortinilla?
Hi, hello.
Hello, Michelle. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on the time zone in which you are. On behalf of my colleagues and coordinators, Diana Mendez, Pedro Urquijo, Alfredo Pureco, Timothy Lorek, and Antonio Chamorro, I welcome you to the Interinstitutional Global Seminar on Green Regulation, an academic space supported by el Colegio Mexiquense, el Instituto de Investigaciones Dr. José María Luis Mora, y el Centro de Investigaciones en Geografía Ambiental de la Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. It's a pleasure to have your presence today in this 10th session in which we are going to discuss the Green Revolution in Europe. This is the second session of 3, and we are going to discuss this topic. Well, in this occasion, the professor, Reynaldo de los Reyes, is going to be the moderator. So I'm going to present to you briefly. Well, he is PhD from the Colegio de México. Well, now he is currently in a postdoc position at the University of Genève. Well, Professor de los Reyes, I give the floor, and go ahead, please. And thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Nessa, and thanks to the coordinators of this seminar for inviting me to lead this session. I'm very honored to be with these amazing researchers. And as Nessa said, this is, I think, the 9th session out of 16, 10th session out of 16 dedicated to discuss the Green Revolution globally, in global perspective. So for this session, we have 4 participants. So maybe the time will be a little tight. I will ask you to please manage your 15 minutes. In which you can share with us your thoughts and your presentations. You can share the screen if you want to do it also. And at the end of the 4 presentations, we will have time for a section for Q&A and a discussion, which I hope will be very interesting. So without further ado, I would like to present the first participant, which is Michele Sollai. Michele is a postdoctoral researcher of the Swiss National Science Foundation, currently a visiting scholar at the Center for History of Science Po in Paris. Dr. Sollai obtained his PhD in International History in 2022 from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, with a thesis on the history of agrarian development in Ethiopia from fascist colonialism to post-World War II international aid. Dr. Sollai's current postdoctoral project is titled The Global Battle of Wheat, Mobilizing Science for Agrarian Development in Fascist Italy, Center on the historical analysis of agrarian and environmental sciences, such as plant breeding, plant pathology, and agroecology. The Global Battle of Wheat examines the emergence of a fascist green revolution in interwar Italy and its relationship with 20th century evolution of agrarian modernization on a global scale. Dr. Sollai's research interests include the history of development, environmental history, the history of science and technology, the history of fascism, the history of colonialism, the history of international organizations, agroecology, and agrobiodiversity studies. So thank you very much for being with us today, Dr. Sollai, and you can start at any moment. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you, Reynaldo. Thank you for having me here at this session. I think I'm going to share the screen and share with you the PowerPoint. Can you see it full screen?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, so the title of my paper that I would like to present to you today is called The Fascist Green Revolution. My interest on a general level on the Green Revolution stems from a new project which I've been developing since last year, as Reynaldo mentioned, a project which looks at the history of science and agrarian development in fascist Italy, and particularly at the creation and diffusion of so-called elite wheat varieties in Italy, but also globally during and after the interwar years. So what I will try to do essentially in this short presentation is to introduce you to a set of ideas that I've developed while thinking of why and how this history might be identified as a fascist green revolution. But first, let's take a step back and reflect a little bit on the historiography of the Green Revolution as a whole. So I think one important way in which we could interpret the history of the Green Revolution would be by viewing it essentially as a history of science-driven seed mobilities. Let's think, for example, of the key role ascribed to US plant breeders and to the transfer of miracle wheat seeds from Mexico to Asia for the alleged resolution of world hunger in the 1960s. But the history of the Green Revolution, is also a history of seed immobilities and disruptions. For example, of how environmental, social, and economic factors prevented miracle seeds to take hold in certain places, and how these spurred new ways of thinking the value of local crops, climates, and knowledge systems over imported technological inputs. So it is by focusing on these seed mobilities and immobilities, global connections and local disruptions, that I believe we can move beyond conventional spaces, actors, and periodizations of the Green Revolution. That we can expand our perspective, including, but also beyond, Borlaug and the Rockefeller Foundation, Mexico and India, and the second half of the 20th century. So it's from this perspective, by following the seed travels, that I believe we can include the history of crop improvement and agrarian modernization in fascist Italy within the trajectory of a long and also wide green revolution that runs through the 20th century. So for the sake of brevity, I will now sort of follow the travels of just one key seed variety of the fascist green revolution, the elite bred wheat cultivar named Mentana that was created in 1923. So the seed travels of Mentana take us first of all to fascist Italy's Battle of Wheat, which was a vast plan of science-driven agrarian development launched since 1925 by Mussolini's regime in order to intensify agricultural production and thus achieve food, and especially wheat, which was the main staple of the Italian population, autarky or self-sufficiency. So the Battle of Wheat had many components, but probably the most crucial one was the seed replacement strategy. There is the dissemination of new high-yielding so-called elite bred wheat cultivars in lieu of all traditional bred and durum wheat land races. So key to this endeavor was the plant breeder Nazareno Strampelli, fascist Italy's own wheat wizard, as he was called at the time. So Strampelli became a scientific superstar in the mid-1920s thanks to his innovative hybridization program that he started since the early 20th century, which essentially, by crossing local land races with a Japanese cultivar named Akakomugi, allowed to obtain a set of new varieties combining rust resistance, semi-dwarf height, and therefore resistant to lodging from increased use of fertilizers, and photoperiod insensitivity, allowing in theory, therefore, for the wide adaptability across Italy's diverse agroclimatic conditions. So from this endeavor then came the protagonist of my presentation today, the cultivar Mentana, which since its release in 1923 was celebrated as the so-called masterpiece of Strampelli. So the fascist regime framed Mentana as one of the key technological inputs to increase the yields of wheat farming to the point of self-sufficiency. As such, from the mid-1920s onwards, we see multiple attempts to introduce this variety across the whole of Italy's national territory, and also beyond in Italy's colonies of Libya, Eritrea, Somalia, and since 1936, Ethiopia. So the sea travels of Mentana were not entirely successful. Mentana turned out to give high yields only in the wet, fertile, and rich lands of northern Italy. You can see here a map showing the percentage of diffusion of elite races Mentana included throughout different provincial areas of Italy. And you can clearly see that in the northern part of Italy, the percentage of diffusion were much higher than in the south. And indeed, Mentana did not exactly meet fascist expectations in the dry, semi-arid agroclimatic conditions of what I define as Italy's semi-arid empire, which included the colonies, of course, but above all the so-called Mezzogiorno, the poor and allegedly underdeveloped southern half of Italy. But this disruption did not entirely end in a standstill, far from it. The failure of Mentana in the Italian South, especially, opened multiple ways, and that is the sort of my argument, for the emergence of scientific counter-narratives and agroecological alternatives to the hyper-modernizing dogmas of crop improvement as embedded in the idea of elite races. So, for example, once agrarian scientists realized that elite bred wheat cultivars were not adapted to the semi-arid climates of the Italian South, then they started encouraging instead the diffusion of improved durum wheat cultivars, as durum wheat in fact was more ecologically adapted to the region and was already part of the traditional farming systems and diets of the local southern Italian population. So along similar lines, plant breeders in southern Italy developed also an alternative strategy to the idea of wide adaptation approach, the wide adaptation approach envisaging the diffusion of a single or a few high-yielding new modern varieties, arguing instead for what I define as a deep adaptation approach, one that sought to adapt rather than triumph over the agroclimatic features of the Italian South and valorize rather than replace local indigenous agrobiodiversity. So part of this approach was, for example, the collection, pedigree selection, and diffusion of indigenous durum wheat landraces so as to combine adaptability to local climates and soils with higher yields and milling qualities, or always with the same goal in mind. Southern plant breeders also experimented and introduced foreign wheat varieties, but coming from environments that presented similar agroecological features as southern Italy. For example, Tunisia and Morocco and French North Africa in general, and also Western Australia, creating a sort of a trans-imperial, transnational network of exchange of both scientific knowledge and seeds and materials. So overall, therefore, we might say that Italian green revolutionists learned to adapt their approach to the peculiar agroecologies of southern Italy and the colonies, co-opting, yes, but also in a way valorizing indigenous agrarian knowledges and local wheat genetic resources within their agrarian developmental framework. Then this part of the second part of my presentation is not really present in the paper that I sent, but since the general sort of spirit, the general framework of this series of seminar, I thought it was worth to say something about that too. So because the travels of Mentana also take us beyond Italy's metropolitan imperial boundaries, right to the original breeding ground of the Green Revolution. So thanks to Italian scientific and expatriate networks in Central and South America, since the 1930s, Mentana made its way into Mexico's wheat fields and experiment stations. At the start of the Rockefeller Foundation's Mexican agricultural program, Borlaug identified Mentana as a Mexican variety and included it in his breeding program, and then crossing it with varieties from Kenya, obtained Quintana 48 and Lerma 50, which became highly successful in Mexico in the 1950s due to their resistance to the virulent 15B race of stem rust. And then as Borlaug crossed Mentana with other Mexican, Kenyan, and Japanese cultivars, Mentana ended up leaving its genetic mark in the pedigree of nearly all of the most celebrated Green Revolution varieties that were then transferred to India in the 1960s. Then, other than Mexico, we can say that in general, Mentana liked Latin American agroclimates very much. This cultivar, for example, became the basis for wheat improvement programs in Brazil in the post-war years, and was introduced and widely cultivated already in the 1920s due to its ecological adaptability and rust resistance. And then in 1940 was then crossed with the variety Fronteira to create Frontana, which became the most widespread variety in Brazil in the second half of the 20th century, as you can see then from this sort of pedigree tree that all starts from Mentana in Brazil's wheat improvement program. Then last but not least, Mentana also made its way to Peru, thanks to an Italian fascist technical assistance mission called by the president of the government of Peru, Oscar Benavides, in the mid-1930s to help the country expand and intensify national wheat production. The two experts shown here in the pictures above, Consolini and Modena, were the leaders of this Italian Mission Trigueira, and recommended a series of technical improvements in a way based on the model of the Italian Battle of Wheat, and among them including, above all, the introduction of the Mentana cultivar. So then in the following years, this idea was sort of established, and the Ministerio de Fomento in Peru started an experimentation program around Mentana, around this variety, and then started distributing seeds to farmers, to Peruvian wheat farmers in different agroclimatic regions, and mostly in the Central Sierra. So to conclude, all these tour de force following the sea travels of Mentana have taken us from fascist Italy to unexpected places. They are, I think, an entry point into otherwise hardly visible historical dynamics and connections. And again, in conclusion, I'll just come full circle to emphasize how taking seeds as framing devices, I think, makes it possible to view the history of plant breeding and agrarian modernization in interwar Italy as a fascist green revolution, a history which is part of multiple connected green revolutions over space and time, whose overall trajectory allow us to blur the analytical boundaries between metropole and colony, for example, between global north and global south, Europe and the rest of the world, and at the same time bridge the gaps between micro-histories of local disruptions, such as the one that I just mentioned in southern Italy, and global histories of transnational flows. And I think my time is almost running up, so I think I'm done. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Dr. Sollai. I would love to read more about that second part. It's very interesting. So let's move on now to our second presentation from Professor Anton Schuurman. Professor Schuurman is Associate Professor Emeritus at the Share Group Economic and Environmental History from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. He has published on material culture, rural transformations, historical demography, and the relationship between social theory and history. His main expertise is on the history of the Netherlands in the early modern and modern period. He's now finishing a book in Dutch, which means that we will not be able to read it, on the making of agricultural governance in the Netherlands in the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. Together with Jordi Planas from the University of Barcelona and Yves Segers from the University of Leuven, he will be he will publish a volume in the Rural History in Europe series published by Repulse, provisionally titled The Formation of Agricultural Governance, the Interplay Between State and Civil Society in European Agriculture, 1870 to 1940. So please, Dr. Schuurman.
Okay, thank you. I also will upload my presentation. One moment. Sorry, I have to close some other things so that I
Is everything okay? If I
no,
have your...
the problem is I close this one. Yes, I had difficulties in finding my presentation. So now you can see it, isn't it?
Yeah, we can see it. Not in full screen, if you can.
Not in full screen, okay.
No.
But now?
Yeah,
yes?
now it's okay.
Okay, yeah. I'm sorry. Good. Here, this is what I want to tell you. I'm not using the concept of green revolution, but I'm talking about agricultural modernization. And I will stress in my talk that it's more than just technical modernization and invention, but also social invention. That's the main focus, in fact. I will start with saying something about agricultural modernization in the Netherlands after the Second World War. And then my main point is about the formation of agricultural governance in the Netherlands in the 19th century and the influence of it. And then how this encountered new challenges since the 1970s. And again, but in a different way, since the beginning of this century. And I will end with saying something about what can the history of this agricultural modernization say about our options for new governance arrangements. So let's start with Dutch agricultural modernization after the Second World War. Well, as in many other places, the goals were food security, affordable food prices, and a reasonable income for the farmers. And what was excluded was an ecological sound agriculture. And well, the best book, in fact, that tells the story is a book by my colleague Jan Bieleman, and he distinguished 5 strategies. And you find them, in fact, in all Western European countries: mechanization, rationalization, upscaling, intensification, and specialization. And agricultural modernization, in that sense, was really successful after the Second World War, as I will show now from some graphs, by some graphs from him. So first, you see the problem, in fact. At the one hand, after the 1945, the cost of labor was rising strongly, while the price of milk and price of wheat remained rather low. And then you see that, well, they succeeded in increasing the yields of wheat and increasing the milk yields. And also production was raised by the change to market gardening. And this was not just a result of market forces and the practice of farming, but certainly also of agricultural governance. And you see how after 1950, the number of employees of the State Agriculture Extension Service was really high. Okay, so in terms of its own goals, productivity, efficiency, agriculture modernization after the Second World War was a huge success. But when you just look at this after the period after the Second World War, it looks whether it happened just then, but it was embedded in much earlier developments. And for the Netherlands, you talk really already about developments in the early modern period, when the Netherlands were already an urban economy, and also when agriculture was already strongly commercialized and specialized. But that was still in conditions of the early modern period. And things changed thoroughly in the 19th century. And in the 19th century, there are, in fact, you should distinguish between two separate developments. Most of the changes within Dutch agriculture were caused by market conditions. So farmers changed what they produced in relation to prices. And well, the conditions, they changed too in the 19th century. So the repeal of the Corn Laws, of course, therefore London became an important market. But also in the second half of the 19th century, globalization, which changed the prices for supply and demand. And certainly also the industrial and fossil energy revolution, which changed the production conditions. But this is all a story about market. And then the other thing what happened was a formation of an agricultural governance. There was created an agricultural public sphere and infrastructure, what I call the agricultural institutional matrix. And so let's talk about this agricultural institutional matrix. That's completely new, that it's an environment that did not exist before. So there was created a national public sphere in which agricultural organizations, newspapers, newsletters, meetings, exhibitions were present, and they created a common discourse, you can say. There was created specific agriculture education. It started with scientific education and then primary and secondary education. Then also at the end of the 19th century, specific agricultural research was created with experimental stations, laboratories, etc. And certainly as important as that was the creation of a Ministry of Agriculture, which regulated, stimulated, and started organizing agriculture together with the civil society. Also new at the end of the 19th century were agricultural factories for sugar beet, potato flour, butter and milk factories, of course. They were as well private as public. And finally, there were a lot of cooperatives also created by civil society for purchase, credit, sales, auctions. And all these elements created a public-private shell around agriculture. And during most of the 20th century, the two distinct developments that directed the course of agriculture, the market and the agricultural governance, went hand in hand. And of course, there were all kinds of struggles and problems, but they went together. And after 1960, there new problems come. So there's productivity and efficient goals are no longer enough. It becomes clear that there are environmental issues, animal welfare issues, quality of products, landscape. But I would say what we can learn from that, what happened in the 1960s, is that this was a challenge for agriculture, but it did not cause a real change in the direction of agriculture. However, what happened after the 70s, you could say in the period of neoliberal thinking, was the demolition of the public-private shell. So the organization of agriculture became much more dependent from the market. I said there were new problems in the period after the 1970s. Again, new problems, of course, as we all know, are since the 21st century. But I want to stress that when we look at the new challenges, the first one is that we increase agricultural production in order to feed the growing world population. But then the second one is new conditions of climate change and loss of biodiversity that threaten our way of life. And so therefore, this time, there is a real challenge for agricultural modernization in a new context and at a new level. And so in the Netherlands, you could say agricultural modernization as it was is in a kind of dead end. And we can see it every day in our newspapers, all kinds of demonstrations and problems and struggles and contestations. So as I said, this ecological dimension asks for a change. And also what should change is that one of the things that happened during the agricultural modernization in the 20th century, that agriculture was more or less outside society. It was in a different space, but we should see that agricultural problems are part of our contemporary problems, and also the solutions for agriculture are also part for other issues. Also, of course, we have to be aware that when I talk about the 19th century, we see that it took a long time that this formation of agricultural governance came into existence, but this time we have really less, the time frame for change is shorter. There are some headwinds. As I told, the public-private shell that was really important for agricultural governance in the 20th century is undermined. There's a strong dominant power of the market, as well in practice as in economic theory. The civil society is fragmented. There's a strong individual mindset versus collective mindset. And as we also all know, there's a gridlock in international order. But when we look at options for new governance arrangements, I still would say, yes, in spite of the gridlock, there is an international public sphere. There are all kinds of international organizations that we can use for changing things. And the last 50 years, I would say, have also been used for making all kinds of new discourses, new concepts. And I find them rather nicely summarized in the book, The Economics of Biodiversity, the Dasgupta Review, where you see many of these new economic concepts and agricultural propositions. Also, already the impulses for new policies started, and I think then of the Paris Agreement, Sustainable Development Goals, the EU Farm to Fork program, Green New Deal. So it means that there starts to be a consensus about which way the solution could be. Then, and this I take from my colleague Nick Koning, we also have to again make international policies, and he stresses that what we need is to encounter too strong market volatility, and also to be aware of the failures of the agricultural markets that started, in fact, at the end of the 19th century. And he also pleads for, and I second that, for the protection of agriculture for the development of agriculture in Global South. Then education, research, and extension should become again more business of the public-private shell and not just of agribusiness. Finally, what I want to say, what is the message, in fact, of what we've seen in agricultural modernization in the Netherlands, is that it's a multi-layered affair, and that we should try to connect encompassing challenges like the increase of food production and the new ecological problems within local conditions and context, and the persons who are best situated for that are the farmers themselves. But they should make new overlapping social networks and coalitions in order to start collective actions that goes beyond individual agency. So what I've done in this presentation, and I hope that that became clear, is that yes, agricultural modernization was successful. It was prepared by agricultural governance that was created in the 19th century, but that needs to renew now in face of our new challenges. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Schuurman. I want to remember to our audience, both in Zoom or in YouTube or Facebook, and if you already have some questions, you can write the questions in the chat, or you can wait until the end of the session. So now, now we will hear to Professor Yves Segers. Professor Segers is Professor of Rural History at KU Leuven in Belgium, and director of the Interfaculty Center for Agrarian History at the same university. His main fields of research are the history and heritage of agriculture, the countryside, and food systems in Europe since 1800s. Recently, he published, together with Leen van Mol, Agricultural Knowledge Networks in Rural Europe, 1700 to 2000. And furthermore, he published many research articles in international journals, such as Journal of Rural Studies, Agricultural History Review, Historia Agraria, Environment and History, Food and History, Appetite, Food and Food Waste, and European Economic History Review. So thank you, Professor Segers.
Thank you very much, Reynaldo, for this nice introduction, and also to the organizers of this webinar for inviting me to share some thoughts and insights from my research. I'll try to present my PowerPoint I prepared. I hope you can see it.
Yes, we can see it, but we are waiting for the full screen.
And maybe now it's
it's there.
Already clear. Okay, so thank you again. I've prepared a rather short presentation in which I will focus much more on one aspect, and I think a core element of the Green Revolution, or maybe we should say the Green Revolutions in the world of the past 2 centuries, and I will focus on the importance of knowledge and knowledge circulation and the development of knowledge networks, mainly in Europe, but of course these networks were also connected with other parts of the world, with colonial territories, and of course also other regions in the world. I think it's not necessary to say a lot about the definition of or the classic definition of the Green Revolution, and which is it's mostly defined as a development project started after the Second World War, mainly by United States or Western scientists and investors, to foster food production, to stimulate agricultural productivity in less developed countries like Mexico, India, etc., and by transferring modern scientific knowledge and technology from the West to the global South, food production indeed increased, and productivity also in order to cope with food shortages and high high food prices, hunger, etc. More recent, and I want to refer here to the thought-provoking book and even more publications of Jonathan Harwood, who underlined that the Green Revolution is much more complex, as we can read in rather classic and traditional historiography. Maybe from an economic point of view, it was a success, but we may not neglect the negative aspects of it, like the negative impact on the environment, but also the negative impact on the position of small-scale farmers, which became more and more dependent from international aid, international companies, the agribusiness, etc. And also what my colleague Anton Schuurman already underlined is that the Green Revolution also has its clear link and similarities with earlier revolutions, phases of agricultural modernization in 19th and 20th century. And what is very interesting, I think, is the exchange process that occurs in that Green Revolution in the West, but also in the global South, between continents, but also the exchange of knowledge within certain countries and between different actors. So one of the points I want to make here is that one of the core elements, and in my research, or in my opinion, one of the most interesting one, is the development of the production and diffusion of knowledge. And what I want to do now, and today for you this morning, for me this evening here in Belgium, is to highlight, to focus on some major conclusions of a research project and a book we produced last year about the development of agricultural knowledge networks in rural Europe. I'm happy I opted for this approach because in the beginning I thought to present to you something about revolutions, agricultural revolutions or modernization processes in Belgium. But after Anton, his presentation, I can say that in Belgium, the development was to a large extent rather similar as in the Netherlands. Anton also underlined the importance of knowledge and education and research. And I think for that reason, my presentation is rather complementary to his one. I think focus on the production and diffusion of knowledge is very important because, of course, that is one of the main engines of development and innovation and modernization. And what we try to develop in this book is the concept of agricultural knowledge networks, and with stressing the concept of networks, we want to underline that knowledge circulates, and while it is circulating, it's transferred, rewritten, reinterpreted, not only by scientists, but also by intermediaries, and do not forget also by farmers themselves. So what we also want to underline is that the circulation, the transfer of knowledge is not a top-down process, but can also be a bottom-up process. It goes in multiple directions, and multiple actors are involved in this process. In the book, you can find 10 contributions, each of them focusing on a specific case, from Scandinavia to Spain, from cattle breeding towards the development of the extension service in the UK. And I will come back in the next two slides on at least, that's my opinion, some important general conclusions and findings. But first, I want to say something about, I think, an important specific aspect of the farm sector, and that is that farming is a specific economic activity that is very dependent from specific factors that a farmer cannot control completely, like the climate, weather conditions, soil characteristics, and of course that has a huge impact on the development of farming activities and the farm business itself. Farmers are also, most of them are small-scale enterprises or medium-sized enterprises, in the past even more than today, which means that from a knowledge perspective, the majority of farms don't have the resources, don't have the time to invest in their own research and innovation very intensively, which makes them quite dependent from others, from other actors in the food system. And that's also why, and Anton referred to this, that from the late 19th century onwards, the state governments has started as a reaction to an international agrarian depression with setting up what you could call a knowledge offensive in order to modernize farming in, let's say, Europe, the European continent, and definitely in Western Europe, and that makes, in fact, that that special relationship between farms, the farmers, and other actors in the food system, because farmers do need help, support in order to innovate, to gain new knowledge, and not only the state, of course, but also civil society, as Anton also mentioned in his presentation. So what can I present to you as main conclusions of this book and this joint research effort? What can we say about the main characteristics of European knowledge networks that developed from indeed the 18th century towards the beginning of the 21st century? And I think also many of these characteristics, we can project them to the global south, to colonial territories in the late 19th and 20th century. What we see is that from the late 18th and early 19th century, we see an increasing number of knowledge networks that operated, functioned on the European continent, characterized by a complex web of actors, farmers, but also intermediaries like consultants, but also private companies, commercial enterprises. Those networks can be formal, like agricultural associations, like farmers' unions, cooperatives, but also can be very informal. An important way of gaining a new knowledge was, of course, to look what other farmers did, to listen to your father, your grandfather, your mother, your grandmother. So all kinds of knowledge networks existed and had an impact on the modernization of farming activities. We may not forget that these actors very often had multiple and even conflicting interests and objectives, from economic objectives to also political objectives and social objectives. And I don't think that this is very specific for the European continent, but also goes for the global south. Access to knowledge, a second point, is very important. It's about inclusion and exclusion. Who can join a knowledge network and who cannot, and why? Is it because you can't read and for that reason cannot have an easy access to new knowledge, for instance, in the 19th century? on European continent, or even after the Second World War in the global South? Or is it because social and cultural barriers prevent farmers to join more elitist and learned societies in order to know much more about new technology, new innovations, or just information about market prices, etc., etc. Thirdly, what we see is that over time, many ways were founded, many means existed to diffuse and circulate old and new knowledge from books and articles, lectures, demonstrations fields, towards radio, television programs, podcasts today. The agricultural sector is very innovative in looking for interesting ways and means to diffuse knowledge, old ones and very new ones. A fourth important point, I think, is the important impact of economic crisis. Anton, in the previous presentation, and I also already in mine, refer to the late 19th century agrarian depression on European continent, which was a start of a knowledge offensive, you can call it, but also during the interwar period as a reaction to the Great Depression of the 1930s, but also after the Second World War, we see that these crises, whether they were economic or political or social, created a boost in looking for new ways of stimulating the agricultural sector to modernize or to cope with the challenges of that time. And very often the answer to these challenges is innovation, education, extension, and via this offenses, steering and guiding farmers towards a direction the government or the state or farmers' unions think is the best direction for the future. I also referred many times to the state, but let's not forget that the state was not the sole actor in this knowledge offensive we see in 19th and 20th century. Also many other actors were involved. And what we indeed see is that between late 19th century and let's say 1960s, 1970s, there was a very intense collaboration between the state and civil society actors, which succeeded in modernizing the agricultural sector on European continent. And maybe that collaboration, but that differs from country to country, diminished from the 1970s onwards, and because let's say the market became much more important. What I find myself very interesting is to investigate the role of what I call cultural amphibians, the intermediaries between, let's say, scientists and the farmers. Can be consultants from the state, can be consultants who work for commercial enterprises, but these cultural amphibians had a huge impact, I think, on modernization within the farming sector, because they translate new knowledge from the laboratory to the field, to the farmers, but also vice versa. They talk with farmers, they know what their challenges, their problems are, and they transfer these questions to scientists in order to find a solution. So these translators of challenges and problems within the agricultural sector, I think, are very important and very interesting to investigate in the future. And let's not forget the agency of farmers within revolutions, or within, in my case, the development of knowledge networks. And farmers are much more than the actors who receive new knowledge and new innovation, and who are very thankful and will work with these new innovations. And not at all. They can protest. They have their own power, their own agency, and it's very interesting to investigate why some innovations, why some new knowledge is accepted by farmers, and why sometimes innovations are refused by farmers. And all these elements are developed and elaborated in the book. So as a conclusion for my presentation, I want to underline that what we see is that already from the late 19th century, from the Enlightenment movement, we see that there existed tensions between what you can call science-based agriculture and practice-based agriculture, between scientific knowledge and tacit knowledge. And it's also thanks to these cultural amphibians that some kind of hybrid knowledge existed over time. We see a growing army of experts and advisors, you can call them modern prophets, who want to guide and steer farmers towards the ideal direction and the ideal future. And you could say that the farm business is maybe one of the most patronized professions in the world. For instance, in the United Kingdom, Paul Bresley shows that in his chapter in the book, in the 1950s, 1970s in the United Kingdom, there are more than 40,000 consultants working in the agricultural sector related to public actors, and also 10,000 consultant or intermediaries working for commercial enterprises. And so you see that there are a lot of people around farmers who want to sell products, who want to stimulate them towards a certain direction. And then the question is, what kind of power to resist have farmers, not only in Europe, but also in the global South, in the past, but also today and even tomorrow? Can they develop their own path? What can we learn from the past to guide them, to support them, and to make, I think, the very necessary transition of today towards a more sustainable and more fair agriculture? And to conclude, what I think, and I already mentioned it a couple of times, I think from that knowledge networks perspective, it will be very interesting in the future to investigate much more the perspective of the farmers, to look for the voice of the farmers, not only in Europe, but also in the global South. I try to do that with some research on agricultural knowledge networks in the Belgian Congo in the 20th century, but also to reflect about the resistance of farmers. Did that lead towards alternative strategies, alternative farming concepts? And I think that is very promising for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to you, Professor Segers. I read the introduction of the book, and it's really fascinating. I hope to read it. To read the whole book later. So let's move now to our last presentation. I will present now Professor Peter Moser. Professor Moser studied history in Switzerland and Ireland. In 1995, he received his PhD with a thesis on rural society in the west of Ireland from the University of Bern. Peter Moser is the initiator and director of the Agricultural History Archive in Bern, founded in 2002. I actually encourage you to look at this archive. You can Google Agricultural History Archive in Bern, and you will find an amazing repository of digital sources. This is the Switzerland's first virtual archive, and is dedicated at home and abroad to the archiving of sources on agricultural and nutritional history, as well as scientific research. From 2005 to 2009, he represented Switzerland in the management committee of the Cost Progressore Action. From 2009 to 2019, he chaired the Swiss Society for Rural History. Since 2012, he has been a member and treasurer of the European Rural History Organization, and since 2019, president of the Rural History Film Association. Finally, since 2016, he has been co-editor of the Rural History Yearbook in Paris. Thank you very much for being with us, Professor Moser, and I give you now the word. Your microphone is off, Professor. We can hear you, your microphone is off.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and sorry about the, I was nervous to find my slides and hope they will. Can you see them?
No, not yet.
You don't see them?
No.
I do.
If you have trouble sharing, I can share your presentation.
Yeah, would you do that? I've sent it to you this morning or during your night. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. So, as I said, thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to talk to this small group of people interested in agricultural development around the world. And my presentation is just a few ideas of how we could conceptualize all the changes, but also the continuities which are characteristic for agricultural development in Europe in from the 18th to the 21st century. So maybe it is worthwhile at the beginning to, can you, yes, because I cannot I cannot move on with the slides, but I will tell you when it is time to move, and you will tell me when it is time to stop.
Okay, so, no problem.
I think it's worthwhile at the beginning to remind ourselves that agricultural practices are always characterized by a high variety of local idiosyncrasies. Soil, climate, topography, and cultural, economic, and social contexts are always different, almost from farm to farm, certainly from region to region, and from continent to continent. But the agricultural practices are also characterized by a relatively uniform impact from outside the farm in the form of decontextualized scientific knowledge, from transnational trade relations and growth-oriented interventions by states and transnational institutions since the late 18th century. And what's also important to remember is that these practices have been subject to strong changes since the 18th century. For example, the access to the lithosphere from the 1940s and 50s made a huge impact, but also the demand for food due to population increases has changed the agricultural practices in the past, and they will certainly change it in the future as well. So in order to understand the changes and continuities, and that's the next slide, in agricultural development since the 18th century, we need concepts, and we cannot avoid a periodization of the time span of almost 250 or so years. So the concept of the Green Revolution can be helpful, but is by definition on its own, of course, not capable to explain the agricultural development in Europe since the 18th century. So I was trying to, or I would like to present three further conceptualizations and periodizations for the discussion today. So maybe we can look at the resource-oriented perspective in the first case, and then would like to have a look at the concept of the agrarian industrial knowledge society as we have developed it over the last couple of years here in the Archives of Rural History. This is a perspective that is focusing on resources, but it's also enlarged by the knowledge aspect and the power relations, two aspects which have been talking about by Yves and Anton already before. And maybe it's also worthwhile to revisit the concepts of the agricultural revolution. So let's start at the beginning with the resource-based perspective. It focuses on the impacts which were created by the use of biotic resources, that is animals and plants, and the consumption of mineral resources. So from this perspective, the period since the 18th century can be divided broadly into a period of mechanization, where the power comes from human beings and working animals, which had to be reproduced in the or within the biosphere. And then the other period, the period since in the second half of the 20th century, the period of motorization, where the power comes from the stocks of mineral resources in the lithosphere. And I have three pictures here, which illustrate what I've been saying before. Maybe the next picture, we can start with the next picture. This is a picture which emphasizes the human power. It is a picture from the mid-20th century from a farmer, from a female farmer who deliberately didn't use animals for her because she was a vegan farmer in Switzerland in the 1930s. So she was using human power. And if you can go back to the first picture, maybe, we see a very typical appearance from the 19th century, where we can see where human beings and animals have been working together. And as you can see in this picture, in this lovely picture here, you not only see, well, you don't see the man at the behind the three animals, but you see the woman beside, but you also see a cow, a bull, and an ox. So you see the variety of animals which were beside horses and dogs were used for working to perform the work which was necessary on the farm. And this was then replaced in the second period by the third picture, which I have chosen for you here. A typical picture from the second half of the 20th century, and you can see where the power comes from here. Well, you don't see where it comes from, but it's in the tank. The power is now in the tank, and it's not anymore provided by human beings or animals. And so that's a very broad suggestion to differentiate 250 or so years. But it's a bit more elaborated concept of the agrarian industrial knowledge society, which I would like to say a few words. This concept was developed from very similar insights, which Yves has shared with us just before, when we were looking at the importance of the knowledge on the farm, but also the process of knowledge, the circulation of knowledge to the farm, from the farm, and that's where we have developed this concept of the agrarian industrial knowledge society. So it is based on the differential impacts the use of biotic resources and the consumption of mineral resources have. That's the starting point, which I've been emphasizing before. But it is focusing on the learning process of the actors in the period from the middle of the 19th to the middle of the 20th century. That is the period of mechanization. And we have seen just before a lovely picture, the front cover of the book by Yves Segers and Len van Molle, which brilliantly emphasizes the failure of the steam engine in agricultural production. It was successful in industry, and it was also successful in, say, for example, threshing. But when it comes to the where you transform something into something else. But when it comes to the process of reproduction, the steam engine was a failure. And instead of the steam engine, it was the working animals, which appear in the late 18th century and in the 19th century. And they really grow, they actually grow up to the middle of the 20th century in their numbers. In most, not in all cases, but in most cases of Western Europe, but also on the other side of the Atlantic. And it's not only the steam engine which was a failure in the 19th century in agriculture, but also institutions had to be adopted. That's what Anton has already emphasized before. These institutions of the agricultural institutional matrix, they were reorganizing the processes according to the seasonality of agricultural production. And say, for example, the agricultural schools, which were developed in the middle of the 19th century, they were a failure. But when they were adopted to winter schools in the second half of the 19th century, they became a success. And the concept of the agrarian industrial knowledge society is also focusing on the changing power relations within the industrial societies. And that's also something which has Anton has already been emphasizing. And what I would call it is a process of integration through subordination in the long term. That means the agriculture sector was integrated into the industrial society by subordinating it in the long term. But in the period of the agrarian industrial knowledge society, that roughly said between the mid-19th century and the mid-20th century, these power relations were much more equal. And because agriculture was still very important, it was still very important to have an agriculture sector. And so the societies adjusted to the agriculture sector as well, even though the agriculture sector was adjusted to the industrial needs and the industrial societies and norms to a large extent. And you could say that the concept of the agrarian revolutions, as they are known for a long time in the in agricultural history, and that's the last slide, which yes, thank you. So this concept of the three agricultural revolutions, they identify three periods with each with its own characteristics. So the first agricultural revolution, which could be dated roughly between the second half of the 18th century and the middle of the 19th century, is a period where growth was for the first time successfully organized. But it's also important to remember it is a growth within the limits of the use of biotic resources. And what's also important, that modernization at that time is primarily associated with agriculture and therefore stimulates industry. And that's changing in the 19th century, and especially in the second half of the 19th century, where I would say that the second agricultural revolution is beginning. And the second agricultural revolution, it also lasts roughly said about for 100 years, which is more or less equal with the time of the agrarian industrial knowledge society, where we have these partially successful attempts to emulate the seasonal agriculture production along the norms of the linear industrial manufacturing of goods. And agriculture is regarded as a problem, but a problem that can be solved through a variety of solutions which are adequate to specific needs, maybe in specific sectors within agriculture or in specific regions. And agriculture as such is still regarded as an important sector. It is, we can also remember that, still the creator of biodiversity, for example, until the first half of the 20th century. And the third agricultural revolution, our colleague Paul Brassley has called it the real agricultural revolution, and we can see why he called it the real agricultural revolution. You could also disagree with that, because but that's another point. We can discuss that afterwards. But say the third agricultural revolution, which covers a much shorter period, and to some extent it is more or less in the same time as the Green Revolution becomes dominant in certain parts of the world. And that's now a time where the subordination of agricultural reproduction under the norms of industrial manufacturing becomes possible to a large extent, because the motorization and the chemization of the agricultural production, they are now based on the same resource basis as the industrial manufacturing. And what we can observe here is a shift in the perspective. Agriculture is now reduced to its role as a food producer, which it wasn't before, because agriculture was much more up to the mid-20th century. And to some extent, it still is much more, but it becomes conceptualized as its sole function as a food producer. And what's also important, a producer of food that can be produced anywhere in the world, or in the laboratory or in vertical farming. It's not necessarily in the countryside. And the other aspect, which is also important, because it has been stressed before by Yves and Anton as well in its perspective, ecology is also conceptualized in a new way today. It is conceptualized as a system of preventing damage, and on the other side as preserving biodiversity in national parks. So ecology is literally split from the agricultural production, which it was an integral part in the first two agricultural revolutions. So I would say that's, given the fact that we don't have too much time, I skip the conclusions, and I would say we can go over to the discussion. Thank you for the attention.
Thank you, Professor Moser. And thank you, all of you. The four of you were great. I think the presentations are complementary in various ways. I will comment on that later on. First, I just want to remember our audience that they can write their questions in the chat, or at any moment you can raise your hand and start with the conversation. So while anybody is making any question, I will make just a very general comment and then two specific questions. Well, my comment is first that all the presentations move us beyond this classic idea of the Green Revolution that you mentioned. I mean, beyond the United States, beyond borders like Mexico and India, and so on, which is one of the main objectives of this seminar. And as I already said, I think the four presentations are very complementary in various ways, but I want to emphasize one of these ways, which is this complex web of actors that you mentioned. I think that Professor Schuurman talked a little about this agricultural institutional matrix and the evolution of this institutional matrix. Dr. Sollai talked about the scientists and the networks of scientists. Professor Segers said something about these mediators, cultural amphibians, what was the other word, modern prophets, and also the agency of some farmers. And Professor Moser talked about other important actor in this process, that are the animals, right? The animals, these organic motors that he talked about in his chapter. So it's very, very rich, this panorama of actors. I want to ask about two specific actors. The first one being, what about the private companies and multinational European companies? Did they play any role in this process? Are there some specific multinational companies that you identify as important for this process? I'm thinking in agrochemical companies, or maybe Nestlé or some those kind of multinational companies. And my second question is for Professor Moser. You said something about dogs being used as draft animals. And I look at the archive and I look for some photographs of dogs as draft animals, and there are some very interesting photographs. But most of them are of dogs being used for transport some products. I'm not sure if dogs were used also in some kind of agricultural activity. I mean, in the field, not just for the commerce of some agricultural products. So I don't know if any one of you that want to jump in for the first question, you can just open your microphone and say something. Or if Professor Moser want to start with the dogs question.
Yes, it's always nice to talk about dogs. Yes, well, it's interesting that the question you put, the way you formulated it and said it's about agriculture, or is it about transport? It's important to remember that agriculture is creating an immense amount of transport needs from the late 18th century and the 19th century. The integration into the industrial society creates an incredible amount of transport necessities, buying to the farm and from the farm. So I think that the dogs are a good illustration of fulfilling these needs. How can we transport, for example, milk on a daily basis, twice a day to the creamery? And dogs are, like horses, are very suitable for that. And most farmers, or a lot of farmers, couldn't afford the horses, or they were trying to not to overwork the horses. So the dogs were very complementary to that. But then, of course, we know that has always been disputed, and animal protection societies in cities were always critical of using dogs. But then on the other hand, you can see from, maybe even more so than from the pictures, you can see from the films we have and from the video essay we created on the working animals, which where you can see the interaction between dogs and children, for example. So, but my point, the crucial point, is that transport becomes an incredibly important thing in agriculture production in the 19th century, and the steam engine couldn't fulfill that, because even statisticians had to acknowledge that they needed more animals to bring the water and the coal to the steam engine than they could replace by not using the horses or the oxen for the plowing. So I think it's an integral part of the agricultural reproduction economy, and therefore it is one of these modernizing aspects which are usually looked at as relicts of an old world, but they only become important in the 19th century in its numbers.
Thank you, Professor Schuurman.
Yes, well, maybe I can say something about your question about the actors. So I would say that the interesting thing, what happens when you look at, certainly in the Netherlands, but also in other European countries, when you look at agricultural modernization, is that is the role of civil society and the role of the unions and the role of cooperatives. And these cooperatives can be private as well as, or well, not I mean, the factories can as well be cooperative as private owned. And so that's something that last, I would say, during a long time in the 20th century. And then in the second half of the 20th century, businesses become more important. And so what I call that the role of the public shell is diminished. That's something I would say in the Netherlands is happening in the 20th century. First, you see that there's a kind of distance between the farmers and the market, and in between them are cooperatives, for examples, or kind of what perhaps Yves would call those cultural amphibians. So that is changing in the second half of the 20th century. And I would certainly also say it's true for the Netherlands, and I would say it's also true in the global South, is the role of the supermarkets, who become owners of plantations and farms, and in this sense are directing the development of agriculture.
Thank you, Professor Segers.
Yes, what I want to add to the comments of Anton is indeed that it's important when we are studying agriculture and agricultural development is also to take into account the importance of the entire food system and the agro-food market, you can also call it in that way, and the position of farmers in that food system, and especially from, at least in Europe or in the Western world, from the late 19th century onwards, you see that in the beginning, especially food companies and the food industry becomes more and more important. But then definitely from the post-Second World War period onwards, you have the increasingly importance of supermarkets, which leads to a shift, a new power balance within the food system, that let's say gradually farmers become more and more price takers, and their influence on the market increased importantly, and that's also why that's also the way we must understand the foundation establishment of farmers cooperatives from the late 19th century onwards. I think in the Netherlands, but in many European countries, mainly starting in the dairy business, and then gradually also in other sectors are related to other agrarian or agricultural activities like auction halls, etc. So I think it's very important also to investigate the importance of other actors in the food system, and to say something about the dogs. Indeed, also in Belgium, we see that dogs and dog carts were very often used to transport milk, fresh milk from the countryside to the cities, mainly by farmers' wives or farmers' daughters. It was their task to sell fresh milk to urban consumers, and I don't have any evidence that dogs were used on the field. Sometimes in Belgium, at least, they were used already from 17th, 18th century in small mills, dog mills at the farm, to produce butter or buttermilk, I think. So.
Thank you, Professor.
Shall I? Sorry, the question about private company and multinationals was addressed to somebody specific or to everyone?
No, to everyone.
Okay, perfect. Then just a few words on that, maybe. Yeah, because it's something that I haven't really I haven't really focused on other actors other than the scientists in my presentation, but there are indeed others that are involved. And if one looks more broadly at this battle of wheat at the so-called fascist Green Revolution as a whole, beyond the role of seeds and the diffusion of high-yielding varieties, there were other, of course, technological inputs included, such as fertilizers, diffusion of tractors, and of course, oil for tractors too. So in that sense, there are multinationals. You see Ford and Caterpillar that publish advertisements in Italian fascist agricultural journals associating themselves with the battle of wheat in order to, of course, sell more tractors to sustain the agricultural intensification effort in fascist Italy. You have also more at the national level, but still projected internationally, companies such as Montecatini, fertilizer producer, which at the time, since the 1920s, was kind of at the forefront of the production of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. That was also, in the sense, pretty much associated with the fascist regime and with the sort of modernization of agriculture in Italy at the time. So, and of course, seed companies around that time in Italy was the time when sort of producers and distributors organized into consortia that then became seed companies, and then sort of they were those that made financially viable the distribution of the hybrid seeds out of the hybrid cultivars that Strampelli, the Italian plant breeder, was producing. So in that sense, of course, also in terms of, to your first point, in terms of actors and networks, this is also something to take into account.
Yeah, thank you. That was very interesting. Diana has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I would like to start saying that I'm really grateful for your presentations. They have been fantastic. In particularly, I enjoyed identifying coincidence between your presentations. For example, in underlying the importance of understanding the conditions of knowledge generation, its circulation in transnational networks, and the role of multiple human and non-human actors. So I would like to ask a question for whoever wants to take it. How do you think we can advance in the knowledge of the functioning of informal networks from for big institutions when archives do not always report on these aspects? What strategies do you use for looking for different actors in archives? How to look at archives with these renewed questions? I ask this because many in the audience are students developing work along these lines and can take advantage of your experience.
Thank you, Diana, for that question. I don't know who wants to start to answer that. Anyone?
Oh, well, sorry, Peter, please go ahead.
No, go ahead, Michele.
Well, since my project is pretty much ongoing, so I'm struggling with this problem. I think especially for us historians that focus on rural history, on agricultural history, one of the biggest challenges that I'm not, of course, the first one to say that, but that has been identified in our discipline is how to bring back the agency of the farmers and how to recover their voice. And of course, archives in that sense are a big important challenge. So either you're extremely lucky and you find a treasure in the style of Ginsburg, The Cheese and the Worms, or you must sort of develop alternative strategies. And in my case, for example, I'm mostly dealing with reports of scientists, both at the headquarters of ministries, but also extension agents on the ground. And it's the on-the-ground perspective that I'm mostly interested in, sort of, because, sometimes these reports, if you sort of read between the lines, you can indirectly always, but in a way, try to, through the eyes of the expert on the ground, of the scientist of the ground, try to get a sense, to get a feeling of what the farmer specifically in that particular context was thinking, was reacting. So in my work in Ethiopia, for example, I call this the development encounter between the expert and the farmer. And it's in these relationships that it's possible sometimes through scientific reports to recover the voice of the farmer. So most of the times you can sort of look for different actors and bring back the voice of different actors only in their relationship with the producer of the archival document, not in isolation from that, which is interesting, but sometimes also problematic, because of course you don't have their direct voice. But this is a way. But of course, it pretty much depends on the type of source that you're looking for. But I'd say even in the driest, in the most technical of scientific reports, it's possible sometimes to see even a glimpse, but still a trace of the voice of those that are voiceless in a way.
Thank you, Peter.
Yes, but maybe I can I'll just say something about the strategies. When we started the Archives of Rural History about 20 years ago, or well, we started 30 years ago, but then it took 10 years to get the institution established. But what we were looking, we have created in these 3 decades connections with the, as we call them, the document producers. They don't like that word. It's another word in German and in French, but they don't like, but we look at them in a little bit in that sense. So we discovered in these 3 decades that there were about 15,000 agriculture institutions. The one, they would all belong to the to Anton's agriculture institutional matrix. And now, of course, we don't have knowledge about all the 15,000, but we know they existed, and we have more or less knowledge about them. And to several hundreds of them, we have still active contact with them, and we are trying to convince them that they are archiving or financially participating in archiving their in their documents they still have, and also in safeguarding the future documents. That's important as well, because for the last 25 years, most documents are in another form, in not anymore in a paper form, in an analog form, but in an electronic form. So we need new technologies for preserving these documents. So that much for the strategy. But I think the creation, what we are trying to do is combining the archiving process with the research process. And that brings me back to what all the 3 of you have said before. And then you can see, for taking up Yves' metaphor of these these actors who are interacting between different levels. And just take the example of the agronomists. Many of them were born on a farm, went to an agricultural college in Switzerland, now went to an agricultural college, went back to the farm or forward to the national university where they were trained as scientists and as agronomists. Then they went back to the agricultural college where they were teaching, or they went back to an agricultural association, to a research station. And what is now really important for the process, for the dynamic of the development in the second half of the 20th century, they were circulating between these institutions. And we have literally hundreds of examples of fellows who were working in a research institution, then they changed over to the industry, say for example the industry in Basel, but also the other way back. It was a constant moving, and that's the way how they brought this knowledge they created from one place to the other. And I think the cooperatives are the best example where you can see this interaction, because the cooperatives, they still belong to the farmers or the producers to a certain extent, and in many cases they still dominate them. theoretically, but that they function according to other logics. And that's exactly why they became successful, because they were anchored still in the farming community and at the same on an international level. And I think the cooperatives are a brilliant example of that. And we should look at them less ideologically and more in terms of what knowledge was created and what impact did it have. And that's the same with what I think is really crucial with the supermarkets, because the supermarkets, when they became successful in the 1960s, the first thing they did, they employed agronomists. You know, and the agronomists, they often agronomists, we have examples in Switzerland. One example is brilliant. He failed to become the head of the Department of Agriculture, you know, and then he went over to the food cooperatives, and he had an incredible impact there. So often you can see how history is open, is contingent in periods like that.
Thank you. Yves, you want to add something?
Yeah, what I want to add, and I think Peter will agree with me, is the importance of moving images. We must much more use alternative documents to understand much better agricultural development, and maybe they also are the ideal way to capture the voice of individual farmers. So I think photographs, moving images, of course, most of them are also not much more than an indirect way to capture the voice of farmers. But I think when studying more recent developments, we may not forget photographs and moving images, especially those ones, let's say from, I think, 1970s that were produced by farmers themselves on their home, at their farm, with videos and cameras, and they can give us a glimpse of what farmers think and do, or even commissioned films. Look at the background, what is not the main purpose of the film, but what is captured indirectly can say a lot, I think. And also interviews, of course, oral testimonies, directly or even indirectly, secondhand. I think today we can go back to, let's say, 1920s, 1930s. So I think when you're studying more recent periods, I think it's a good strategy to combine all kinds of sources. Even radio interviews, for instance, those are kept in Belgium already from the late 1930s, are never used, but according to me are very interesting to capture or try to capture the voice of farmers or actors involved in the food system.
Thank you. Anton? Your microphone is off.
Yeah, I agree with things that Yves said. I want to add something about the 19th century and agricultural modernization. I am using mainly the sources that are made by these cooperatives or by the state agencies. And in fact, they were used also in the 1950s. But the difference between how I'm using them and how they were used at that time is that in the last 50 years, a lot of agrarian historians in the Netherlands have uncovered agricultural productivity in the 19th century based on other sources. So now we have an idea of what happened in agriculture that is reconstructed by historians. And that image can be confronted with the image that's given in these written sources. And then you can see that they claim, for example, that the farmers were not changing, but now we know that's not true. They were reacting to the market in the 19th century, and they were doing a lot of different things. So it's not that we really have the voice of those farmers, but we know more about their practices based on, well, all kind of sources that historians use, like tax records or notarial sources, or etc. Okay.
Thank you all for this, for sharing these advices and different insights of the research process. It's always very useful for students and for any kind of researchers. So maybe we have time for one or two more questions. I don't know, Netza, you want to ask the question?
Well, thank you everyone for their presentations. All were brilliant. Well, let's a little doubt about this institutional metrics that you talk about it. So it's for anyone if you want to answer. Do you believe that there is important to make research about the relationship between the institutional change and the political systems? Because I'm making research in Mexico about this relationship between agricultural modernization, and in different levels, I have found this relationship between where different political actors influenced these modern agricultural modernization paradigms here in Mexico. So I think maybe it's possible to think that there is some importance, maybe also thinking in these fluxes of technologies between the global north and the global south, because the differences in the political systems. Well, I don't know. What do you think?
Yes, well, when I may something about when I may start, I think
sure.
this is indeed interesting. What Yves and I are now involved in a project about agricultural governance in Europe in the period 1870-1940, and already within Europe, you see a huge difference between you could say, the institutional matrix as this formed, as this made in Western Europe and Eastern and Central Europe. And it partly depends, well, it always depends on the context. And for example, so in Western Europe, you see the importance of associations and cooperatives, while after the First World War in Central and Eastern Europe, you see the importance of farmers' parties and political parties. And that's partly connected with the kind of problems. So in Western Europe, you see that things are focused on agricultural modernization, while in Eastern Europe, the problem is more political problem, land reform. And I think that links it perhaps also to the Green Revolution. Then the Green Revolution is, of course, in a context also of huge differences in property, and as a kind of alternative for political solutions. So yes, the institutional matrix is really dependent on the context. And when I may add this, that's also why I wanted to say that, why I wanted to emphasize that nowadays we are in a different kind of context. And I think we all of us agree that things vary a lot between regions and states, and well, there's a lot of variation, but at the other hand, you have a kind of encompassing questions. And those encompassing questions were in some countries there were land reform, while in other countries there were more organization to the market.
Is it okay?
Yeah, Peter.
It's okay. I just want to emphasize what Anton said, but also slightly to add something. Talking about geographical regions, I would completely agree with you, but don't forget that the most Western society, the Irish one, fits into the Eastern pattern. You know, and but Ireland is a very very telling example, because it emphasizes what you were saying, because as I have observed, you know, that in Ireland in the 19th century, farmers didn't learn how to, they learned how to about political philosophies, about political systems, and things like that, but they didn't learn how to keep records or how to write a diary or whatever, you know, and that's depending on the circumstances. So what I would say, the more industrialized, I think it's no surprise that the most industrialized societies in the 19th century, Belgium, Netherlands, Great Britain or England and Wales to some extent, and especially Switzerland, you know, they were the most so-called advanced societies, most industrialized societies, and they were the ones who were the most, they were looking at their agriculture sector because they wanted to transform that sector and model it along their own norms and lines and idiosyncrasies. And that's what I mean within agrarian industrial knowledge society, because farmers, the farming population, but also farm women and children and farm servants, they still had a voice at that time. And that's probably that what's really changing then in the second half of the 20th century and especially in the 21st century. So that's changing. But I think it's really important from the question you said, it's really important and it's linked to the industrialization of a society. And in the, you know, the most conflicts, the most conflictive, the most conflictive societies with the farming population are actually the agrarian societies and not the industrialized societies. Maybe that's changing now. That could be changing if you look at the Dutch case, but that's too short now. But it's an interesting phenomenon we can look at them at the moment.
Thank you, Peter. I don't know if Yves or Michele want to add something.
Maybe just very quick. Thank you, Netza, for your questions. I think they're very much on point. I wanted to address specifically like two points that you mentioned. One, like, if I understood correctly, to what extent does politics influence then the direction of agrarian modernization in specific countries at the national level, but also at the transnational level, at the level, I think you mentioned that, like, does political systems matter in influencing the directions in which transnational networks go, exchange of knowledge and scientific information, so on and so forth. So on the first question, at the national level, in my case, of course, it's a fascist green revolution. So it's a fascist green revolution. So of course, politics do matter. They couldn't be otherwise in a dictatorship. But it's not that simple in any way. Like what I'm trying to do also is to sort of unpack the notion of fascism and the relationship between fascism and science, and to see how different actors, different political actors within the regime reacted and influenced to different ways of doing agrarian modernizations. So even within an authoritarian regime that, at least in terms of propaganda and at the level of planning showed a uniform idea, if you look at how things went on the ground, if you look at how fascism saw themselves within the regime, you see there is room to complexify, to see things in a different manner. And from the transnational viewpoint, That's something that I was interested to explore because, you know, there have been wonderful books in the past that explore the sort of relationship between fascist science in Italy and in other dictatorial regimes, especially Portugal and Spain. You see the Thiago Saraiva's fascist pigs, especially. What I'm interested in exploring is that how the seeds of the fascist Green Revolution and the knowledge, the science of the fascist Green Revolution also went beyond a sort of intra-fascist transnational network. Case of Switzerland, for example, Strampelli, the Italian plant breeder, had frequent correspondences with the Swiss plant breeder Martinet from Lausanne. The same thing goes with relationship with US plant breeders in the Great Plains. So these sort of flows of knowledge go beyond differences in political systems. Of course, they are influenced to a certain extent by them, but they also transcend them. They are transversal to political differences. And I think that's very interesting to explore. Thanks.
Well, we are running out of time, so I don't know if Yves, you want to add something just to close the session?
Well, to close the session, that's a huge task you give me. But no, not at all. I think I just want to thank the organizer, because I think it's very important to exchange ideas and insights from all over the world. And I think maybe Peter criticized a bit the concept of the Green Revolution, but I think it's a very interesting lens to bring different countries, different continents, and different agro-systems together, and to analyze the differences, but also the many similarities between them. So, at least for me, it's quite challenging to bring all those perspectives together, and it creates, I think, new perspectives to analyze also what I thought before are typical European topics, but they are not typical at all. And that's why I think it's very interesting to have these meetings, and I hope that in the future there will be others to bring people from all over the world together who are really interested in agricultural and rural history. I think in the past, under guidance and with the enthusiasm of Peter, we have created in Europe European Rural History Organization, and I think we cannot overestimate the impact and the added value of this network and this community, this knowledge network, I would say. But maybe the next step is to really bring much more together agricultural and rural historians from all over the world. And I think also because especially 19th and 20th century history is so integrated and globalized, I think we must continue these kind of initiatives.
Yeah, well, thank you for those words. I think that's exactly the point of this seminar, and we are very grateful with you for contributing to this session in particular. And we want to thank also to all the people that follow this conversation, and we hope that you can join us in the next sessions. We're looking forward to continue this dialogue, and I think that's all for this session. I don't know if Netza, you want to remind to remember us what the next session will be.
If I remember it's fine, on June 13. And the subject is Europe also, but I think the Mediterranean agriculture.
Okay, it is the last session regarding Europe, right?
Yeah. Yeah, also.
Well, thank you.
And thanks for the words of Yves. Yeah, that's the point. And well, we will think about it, about your ideas. And thank you everyone for being here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.